Good afternoon.
طاب يومكم.
For translation, channel 2 for English and channel 3 for Arabic. القناة 2 للإنجليزية
Channel 2 is for English, channel 3 is for Arabic.
مرحبا بكم في هذا الحدث.
Welcome everyone to this side event. My name is 𝗃صي الاسودي. I am the head of the Geneva International Centre for Justice in Geneva, and I am the moderator of this event. When conflicts intensify, the role of state actors arise. Before we start, I would like to mention that we have with us a photographer, a journalist, and Mrs. Lina from Al-Mauna Association. Other parties are not allowed to take any photos or to have any video set. With the conflicts intensifying, the non-state actors' role arise, along with all violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The spread of those non-state actors is the characteristic of conflicts in a number of countries in the Middle East. Those non-state actors work and operate outside the control of the state. They are deprived of the legal capacity to become a party in any international agreement or convention. This is why a number of questions arise here. Does the international law define and deal with non-state actors? And if the answer is yes, is such type of behavior and approach, is it something that is compelling? And how can we impose on non-state actors to respect human rights and standards? And how can they be made accountable? A number of you has seen that ISIS, Daesh, has infiltrated a number of countries. It has controlled large areas in Iraq, Syria, and some countries in Africa. Yet very few of you have details about the other facets and the other face of non-state military or armed actors, i.e. the armed militias that are now controlling the resources of some countries through taking control of all state facilities. They have also taken control of public funds, private funds, and others. One of the most eminent examples of those actors is in Iraq and in Yemen. Those militias have used the force, and they have represented and posed a threat to inhabitants through a lot of arbitrary arrests and measures committed about everyone, restricting public freedoms, including the right to movement, rights, freedom of expressions, and others. In this side event, we have a number of speakers, and the speakers will give us the examples about such non-state actors in Yemen and Iraq. On my left, we have with us Mrs. 𝗂𝗏𝗏 𝗏𝗏. She is the head of the Secretariat of the Committee on Enforced Disappearance. It is a post that she's held for a number of years. She has overseen the expansion of work of this committee, which is one of the most important treaty bodies. The committee oversees the implementation of the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, which entered force in December 2010. Mrs. 𝗂𝗏𝗏 will talk about the efforts made by the Committee on Enforced Disappearances alongside the civil society in order to document violations and to locate victims and also make non-state actors responsible for those violations accountable. We also have with us Dr. Martin Brown. He is a legal consultant working with the Geneva International Centre for Justice and other organizations. He holds a PhD in human rights law on law enforcement activities, and he has contributed to recent reports on Iraq, and he also has contributed in submitting cases to human rights mechanisms within the United Nations system. We also have with us Mr. 𝗃 𝗪𝗁 on my right. He is a political researcher. He is director of the Yemeni Media Observatory. The Media Observatory is a non-governmental organization that is covering violations committed by Houthi militias for years now. Mr. 𝗃 also chairs the Rights and Freedom Committee in the General Union of Yemeni Journalists. Before giving the floor to the speakers, I would like to add that we have a video that we will be running from Mr. 𝗏 from 𝗏𝗁 Association. He could not be with us, but he has sent us this video. In the name of God, most merciful, most compassionate, ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to thank you for attending this side event that discusses the situation in Yemen, organized by the 𝗏𝗁 Association for Human Rights. We thank you for providing the opportunity for a neutral voice from civil society organizations. The Yemenis hope that you will be able to achieve a positive impact on their lives and their future by restoring the state, overthrowing the Houthi coup, holding perpetrators from all parties accountable, and preventing impunity, as well as compensating the victims. I am the head of the 𝗏𝗁 Association. I find myself compelled to and have the legal duty and moral duty to inform you of the many scenes and images of the human suffering of millions of Yemenis, as monitored and documented by our organization and other partner organizations. These are the horrors that would not have happened had the ill-fated coup carried out by the Iranian-backed Houthi militias against the Yemeni state not happened on September 21, 2014. The Yemenis are suffering from a state of complete collapse in every aspect, especially after the inclusion of the country under Article 7 of the United Nations Charter. Therefore, it falls upon me and my colleagues to convey many of the tragedies and terrible violations of human rights that we have been documented. We would like to thank the Geneva International Centre for Justice for supporting us in this endeavor. The Houthi militias backed by Iran are responsible for the coup carried out against the Yemeni state. Following that, a lot of killing, displacing civilians, sabotaging civilian facilities, recruiting children, preventing the arrival of humanitarian aid, arbitrary arrest, enforced disappearance, torture, violation of the rights of expression and the freedom of the press, restriction of the free press, persecution of human rights activists. All this has taken place following this coup. And at the same time, the internationally recognized Yemeni government bears responsibility for all the crimes committed by its followers and the militias. The Human Rights Council, at its 54th session, has a real and historic opportunities to protect the Yemenis and also to restore the state of justice and hold responsible all those who have perpetrated serious human rights violations. Removing also Yemen from under Chapter 7. It's also very important to lift the unjust United Nations sanctions that were unduly imposed on the Yemenis, led by Ambassador Ahmed Ali Abdullah Saleh and his father. This was a very brief video by Mr. 𝗏, the head of 𝗏𝗁 Association, organizing this side event. Now I will give the floor to Mrs. 𝗃𝗏𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗀. You have 10 minutes, madam, and you can also talk about all the efforts made by the Committee on Enforced Disappearances and how this committee is contributing to ensuring that the violations go not to go into impunity. Thank you.
Everybody, So indeed, I'm here in representation of the Secretariat of the Committee on Enforced Disappearances. No members of the committee could attend the meeting today, so they asked me to give some examples, focusing on the example of Iraq following the visit of the committee to Iraq in November 2022. 2022, sorry. As you know, the convention was adopted in 2006, and it's the Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. It has now been ratified by 72 states, which is still very little, but we are progressing. And it has different parts of the mandate, different activities to promote the prevention and eradication of enforced disappearances. The issue of the responsibility of states, of course, is at the core of this subject matter, simply because an enforced disappearance is defined under Article 2 of the Convention as the arrest, detention, abduction, or any other form of deprivation of liberty by agents of the state or by persons or groups of persons acting with the authorization, support, or acquiescence of the state. So these are key elements of the notion. But of course, in a context such as the ones that have been presented and are the subject matter of today's events, there are some limits. There is a threshold that is sometimes very difficult to identify in terms of a kind of responsibility that the state has in the context related to acts committed by non-state actors. So I'm going to focus on the example of Iraq, but I could take others. I take this one because there was a visit by the committee that was carried out in compliance with its mandate under Article 33 of the Convention, according to which, when the committee receives information, reliable information, informing about grave, serious violations of the provisions of the Convention, it may, after consultation with the state, request one or more of its members to undertake a visit and report back to it without delay. So this visit was requested back in 2015. It was accepted by the state in November 21, and the visit was carried out by a delegation of 3 members of the committee and 1 person of the Secretariat to Iraq in November 2022. At the end of the visit, the committee adopted a report in March 23, which is now a public document, which you can access on the committee's webpage, that contains a description of the situation, the findings, what are the patterns of disappearances and enforced disappearances in Iraq, and makes recommendations that can be categorized in 2 categories. First, you have what the committee has called the preconditions to the implementation of any action to prevent and eradicate enforced disappearances, and then you have a description, a very detailed description of actions that the committee considers necessary the state should take to prevent and eradicate enforced disappearances, addressing very specific issues. Today I'm not going to address all these issues, but focus really on these famous notions of states' responsibility and non-state actors' responsibility with regard in the context of cases of enforced disappearances. This visit is basically just to put in the context a new step in the cooperation and interaction between the committee and the state party. The committee had already communicated various recommendations to the state on the occasion of the examination of states' reports in 2015 and 2020, and in the context of a follow-up to these recommendations in 2016 and 2022. The committee is also in permanent interaction with Iraq in the context of its procedure of urgent actions, which is a procedure through which the committee can request the state to take immediate action to search for and locate for a disappeared person. As of today, there are 578 urgent actions registered with regard to facts occurred in Iraq. All these recommendations that are contained in the report of the visit, of course, take into account what was said before, but they are the result of a thorough analysis of all the information that was provided throughout the visit and also before and afterwards. In this context, the committee reiterates its deep concern that the practice of enforced disappearance has been widespread in much of the territory of the state party over different periods, and that impunity and re-victimization prevail. The committee calls upon the state to address this reality in all its dimensions and diversity, in full respect of the rights of the victims. Really, the dimension, the scope, and the diversity of the patterns of enforced disappearances have been highlighted throughout the report. The the first part of the report indeed identifies patterns in 5 different waves that can be listed as follows. The Bass area, then from 2003 invasion and subsequent occupation to the pre-Daesh period. Third, the proclamation by ISIL of an Islamic caliphate over part of the territory of Iraq and military operations against Daesh from 2014 to 2017. Then the 2018-2020 anti-governmental protests, and a 5th wave, which are ongoing practices. What is impressive is that the official figures provide an average of between 250,000 and 1 million disappeared people in the country. The issue is that right now there is no more clarity as to the extent of the crime. But what is important is that despite this lack of clarity, the information available enables to identify trends. And really, these trends are detailed in the report, but as regard to ongoing patterns, I would refer to a large number of testimonies of disappearances that have occurred following an arrest or detention, or a detention in an unknown place, where testimonies refer to a direct involvement by state authorities of the central government or by authorities of the Kurdistan regional government. Then you also have testimonies of people abducted while going about their daily life and their daily work. And in these cases, the allegations make reference to groups of men wearing uniforms or insignia related to the local police, to security forces, and by uniformed militia. Other patterns of disappearance and enforced disappearances reported to the committee in different governments correspond to acts committed by non-state actors, sometimes with the collusion of state agents. The first of these patterns refer to trafficking of persons, mainly for the purpose of drug trafficking, sexual exploitation, or forced labor, and of which women and children are particularly affected. And also cases of alleged disappearance of children, especially those of Yazidi origin who were born following sexual exploitation of their mother in Daesh camps. In this context, the delegation was informed about cases where, after returning to Iraq, mother had to leave the children in orphanages with the intention of getting them back as soon as possible. However, when they were returning to the orphanage, the mothers were told that their children had been given, usually sold, to another family, allegedly sometimes with direct involvement of the state. So in these cases, there is no information as to the fate and whereabouts of the children. A third pattern is the one of hundreds of families that are still searching for their loved ones, suspecting that they are in camps in Turkey, Syrian Arab Republic, or Islamic Republic of Iran. These people do not have any possibility of contact with the outside world. In all these cases, the responsibility has been highlighted involving, the alleged perpetrators are involving state security agents, foreign military forces, and armed actors, commonly referred to as militias, that have various levels of affiliation or proximity with state and state agents, or on the contrary, who act without the authorization, support, or acquiescence of the state. And that's where we enter into the core of the issue. Basically, all the population of Iraq is concerned by disappearances. But there is a need to clarify really the different levels of state responsibilities depending on the context of the acts that we are referring to. Right now, there is a huge amount, the legal framework is huge. There are more than 30 pieces of legislation that, in a way or the other, address the issue of disappearances. But none of these legislation address enforced disappearances as such. So basically, you have a huge category that is called missing, and under which you have all the cases ranging from disappearances caused by a natural disaster to cases that amount to crime against, to cases that are that could be classified by some people as crime against humanity in some circumstances. I'm not saying that the acts committed in Iraq right now, I'm not clarifying these acts in Iraq right now, but I'm saying that the notion of missing is huge. And within this category, you have disappearances and enforced disappearances. And it's key, essential, to allow for the identification of state authorities and the identification of non-state actors to make a clear distinction between these notions. Right now, there is a draft bill, a draft legislation in the Parliament of Iraq that addresses the notion of missing, but does not address the issue of enforced disappearances. So basically, there is no categorization, which has a clear implication on the possibility for state authorities to identify the different levels of responsibility of the state and to define clear strategies and policies oriented to the prevention and eradication of disappearances, including enforced disappearances. And there is here a need as well to work thoroughly on the notions that will impact on these levels of responsibility. Because as I mentioned before, the enforced disappearance can occur when there is a direct implication of state actors, but also when there is an implication by authorization, support, or acquiescence. The committee has developed a thorough reflection and has adopted a declaration to clarify these different notions and to delimit the scope, the level of applicability of the Convention to the different circumstances where the responsibility of the state is at stake and when the responsibility should be only focusing on the responsibility of the non-state actors that are not, that have been involved. So these are a very broad presentation of the issue, and I remain available if you have any questions. And of course, the declaration of the committee can be consulted. It enters into the details. I really invite you to read it if you are interested on the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Brown. شكرا جزيلا لك.
Thank you very much, Mrs. 𝗂𝗶𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗃. You have gone through the efforts made by the Committee on Enforced Disappearances. I would like to thank you for clarifying these points. I would like now to give the floor to Mr. Martin Brown. He has contributed to a number of reports on Iraq, and he is very much aware of the situation of human rights in Iraq. You have the floor.
For that interesting overview of the work the committee can do to help increase scrutiny on the violations of non-state actors. In the next 10 minutes or so, I want to just outline a couple of the challenges that civil society face in bringing these issues to international scrutiny. This is based on our work with local civil society in Iraq, but in particular, similar points will apply to organizations facing similar challenges across the Middle East in situations we're also familiar with, such as Yemen, which we'll hear about shortly. The international community often talks about militia groups or mercenaries or private military companies, but the label doesn't matter. We know what we're talking about, and it's when there is essentially an outsourcing of security functions to armed groups. And these groups have undoubtedly gained even more ground across the Middle East, and particularly in Iraq, where their power has been entrenched in part due to support from other countries and due to the political turmoil in that country. Either they will exercise de facto control over a region, sub-region, or part of a territory, or they will de facto supplant the power and provision of public services, including but not limited to provision of security services and law enforcement activities in countering what they describe as terrorism. And it's these groups that pose direct and indirect threats to the protection of different fundamental, universal, and indivisible human rights. Alongside that, there are very few opportunities to scrutinize the activities of militia organizations through the UN human rights mechanisms, which are often focused on states. But the legal position is clear, that where an armed group exercises power or effective control on behalf of that state, then both the armed group and the state can be held responsible in different ways for violation of human rights law. And the relevant parts of the laws on attribution of non-state conduct are increasingly used by the UN treaty bodies and UN investigative mechanisms to show that where a state has effective control or directs or funds or adopts as its own the conduct of a non-state actor, that can, in certain circumstances, lead to attribution of the conduct and responsibility to the state itself as well. But as set out a little bit by Alban as well, that is difficult to see in every case. And where that threshold, that line is, it's very contextual. It requires a deep analysis of the facts, preferably by an independent tribunal. And the UN mechanisms do find it difficult to draw the line between who should be responsible in certain situations. And for obvious reasons, it's rare for militia organizations to be brought before domestic courts for violations they commit in Iraq. Victims we speak to and their representatives tell us that they have greater faith, indeed, in the international system to achieve some measure of accountability for atrocities that take place in the provinces of Iraq than they do with their own national authorities. So it is critical and very important and welcome that UN human rights mechanisms are open to delivering findings and recommendations that address the position of non-state actors. I want now to address the situation in Iraq specifically, and one key area of concern raised by our partners is that despite this accepting a country visit from the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, which was very welcome and should be commended, the government of Iraq's response to the report of the country visit and progress over the last few years and the last 6 months since they've received the recommendations has been alarmingly slow. They fail to acknowledge the scale of ongoing and historic violations committed by non-state actors, primarily militias, but also even in terms of addressing the full range of harms caused by ISIS, there are blind spots there. And in particular, the scale and gravity of the problem of enforced disappearances and the related violations, for which we include arbitrary detentions, torture, prolonged and unnecessary punishment for people without proper legal scrutiny, and excessive force by law enforcement, is diminished in the national agenda, described as a very minor matter that has been, that can be addressed by small payments of compensation. That isn't what victims and their families want. They want to know more information about how and when their loved ones disappeared, what happened to them, and if they are dead, where are the bodies? And it's always shocking to me to hear stories of how the victims and the families who know that their loved one was taken aren't given even the most basic information about what happened next. And that sense of closure is a real open sore that isn't soothed by the payment of a small lump sum. That's why there's a cry for justice from the people of Iraq across the regions where there's been the turmoil and successive control by different armed groups. Many of these activities are carried out by non-state actors, militia organizations that have formal hierarchical structures. Those are the direct violations. It is also relevant to note that the government's failure to hold perpetrators accountable, partly due to the breakdown of the rule of law, is an essence of the further indirect harms caused by allowing militias to exist and grow in power and status unchecked. The breakdown of formal law enforcement systems in Iraq, coupled with the government's support of militias in controlling critical justice processes like access to prisons, detention centres, in the removal and examination of bodies, in the court system itself. These are all areas where the influence of the militia has led victims of human rights violations to be blocked in even pursuing the most basic forms of justice. And the result of all that is a very low, almost negligible trust in state authorities amongst victims and their family members to take effective action to tackle their very real concerns. As covered by Alban and covered in the report in detail by the committee, the experts considered that there has been a number of examples across Iraq where the disappearances took place by militia wearing uniforms or people using the authority of the militia's control over the territory, sometimes with the explicit support of the government, sometimes alongside government armed forces, government security forces, sometimes with their implicit support and later adoption of conduct as their own. For example, in Fallujah and al-Saqliwa, we've worked with groups to document disappearances where the testimony is established that it took place with the militia and the armed forces working side by side, using the power and authority of the government uniform, the government badge, to ensure people complied with the demands of the armed group. Evidence keeps emerging every year showing even greater use of mass graves by the militia. We know that burial sites are run by militia organizations because when victims' families go to the municipal authorities to try and get access to find information, they're prevented, blocked from obtaining that information because they're told agreement needs to be obtained from higher up in order to access the sites. And disappearances continue in recent years, particularly surrounding the disproportionate law enforcement response and suppression of the Tishrin movement protests in 2019 and 2020. And our organizations received cases even recently in the last few months of people who've been forcibly disappeared for their role in protest movements in the last year or two. But despite all the documented and reported violations, despite all the new mass graves that are found, with further evidence coming to light concerning secret detention centres, means of torture and related cover-ups, there has to date been no high-profile prosecution of an individual identified as responsible for committing these serious human rights violations linked to the enforced disappearances. That is in part due to the lack of the criminalisation of enforced disappearances itself, but other actions are criminalised, and there has been no prosecution of an individual in Iraq for war crimes or crimes against humanity, for example. But that frozen aspect of the Iraqi justice system, which needs to be addressed urgently. There was discussion of the draft law. It's my understanding that that draft law has been drafted for a long time. And although there's been a commitment by the state to look at it again, it hasn't moved yet in the last 6 months since the committee's report. And we see how the unconstrained activities of non-state actors who have found themselves in positions of power and influence ripple across the whole justice system and is a major factor in the erosion of trust between state, communities, the citizens, and is the cause of their lack of confidence in the rule of law in Iraq. So Iraq continues to face significant institutional challenges, including the need for greater transparency, justice sector reforms, personal capacity building, strengthened legal frameworks that mirrors Iraq's international obligations that it has signed through international treaties, with clear processes put in place to report, provide information, and ensure the cessation of enforced disappearances. And it was very pleasing to, and reassuring to the civil society in Iraq that some of these recommendations were found in the committee's report. And the country report, if I just may run through some of the key recommendations that they took from it. Firstly, there should be new laws implemented. Urgent legislative reform is required to criminalize enforced disappearances. There must be an implementation of a centralized and interconnected register of disappearances. There isn't a central database at the moment. And that database should allow all agencies to access it so they can all work from the same page when it comes to conducting searches. There must be a plan and implementation of a program to actually investigate a comprehensive search and investigation strategy on a nationwide basis, which is difficult given the different levels of control over the territory. Just 30 seconds to conclude, if I may. Unfortunately, Iraq's response to the CD report was to dismiss it. Most of the recommendations to dismiss the scale of the problem and to lay a lot of blame on the activities of ISIS. But that can't be the end of the story, and civil society will be organizing, doing what they can to try and hold Iraq to its commitment to take positive steps to implement its international obligations. But they need resources, they need support, they need funding from the international community, and they also need to know that they can access the international community's mechanisms to ensure justice if they somehow ultimately fail. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brown. You have good hope in terms of documentation and accountability despite the violations committed in Iraq. And we have seen that you have also faith in making non-state actors also accountable. We hope so altogether. We give the floor now to Mr. Al-Ghubari. Mr. 𝗃 al-Ghubari is a Yemeni journalist, and in his paper he will focus on all the restrictions of the freedom of press and other repressive violations committed by different parties against journalists in Yemen. You have 10 minutes, sir. Thank you very much. I would like to talk today about the non-state actors' obligations under human rights law towards accountability for violations committed by militia organizations in the Middle East, in particular Yemen. I would like to give you a panorama or an idea about what the Yemeni press has been subjected to in the past years in Yemen. I would like to give you an idea of the atrocities that the journalists have been victims to. Undoubtedly, the Yemeni press has been subjected to a series of repressive violations committed by various parties for the past 9 years in Yemen. They are led by the Houthi militias. The Houthi militias are responsible for like 70% of crimes and violations against the press and journalists in Yemen. Last month, there has been a beating attack on journalist Majlis As-Samadi. Majlis As-Samadi is the owner and director of the Voice of Yemen radio. This is a radio station that wanted to continue broadcasting despite judicial orders not to, but it has been looted by the Houthis. So the Houthis have looted the radio stations. And also, some journalists have been put in prison just because they have expressed their opinion on YouTube or other social media sites. What I want to say that there is like a state of Houthi hostility against journalists in Yemen. They have double sanctions imposed on them. And this has reached even death penalty rulings. This means that a lot of journalists that have been subjected to violations prefer today to remain silent and prefer not to work anymore as journalists. We have seen many amicable solutions that have been reached in prison through the intervention of tribal mediation or businessmen away from the pressure and influence of the media. The idea that they wanted just a way out. On the other hand, journalist Ahmed Maher is still in one of the prisons of forces affiliated with the Southern Transitional Council. The legal procedures that preserve his rights as a citizen and journalist are totally lacking. Meanwhile, on September 20, 2023, journalist 𝗃صي 𝗦𝘁، editor-in-chief of Aden Al-Ghad newspaper, has been arrested in a case that they say is publishing false news. At the same time, and 2 weeks ago, the authorities of the Maghreb Governorate affiliated with the government released 2 journalists, Mana Sulaiman and Hafiz Mutayeb. They have been imprisoned for 3 months just due to charges related to what they have written on social media sites. The international community has covered Yemen in details, as Yemen today is one of the harshest and most difficult scene where journalists can work today. And Houthis come at the second place following Daesh in terms of parties targeting journalists. The Houthis see that journalists are hostile to them because they are expressing what they want to hide. And when they have invaded Sana'a, the first thing they have done is to silence all media or state-owned media. The the Houthis have closed the television channels, local radio stations, and this is what they wanted to do. They wanted to silence journalists. But of course, journalists try to find other channels in order to broadcast and to express their opinions. Before the invasion of Sana'a, there have been 15 radio channels broadcasting in Sana'a. All those channels have been closed. We had the Yemen channel, the Sabah channel, and Iman channels. They have been closed. They have been used in order to disseminate a propaganda of terror and death. YouTube and Facebook and Twitter have seen this phenomenon, and they have repeated all those videos that have been issued by the Houthis, and they were calling for hatred, for death. The Houthis stopped 3 newspapers as well that have been issued by the civil society. The Houthis have stopped also international and local radio stations as well as television stations in all governorates. And those channels today have been controlled, and they are also broadcasting hatred, death, and Houthi propaganda. Yemenet is the only service provider in Yemen. It has also been controlled by Houthis. 165 news sites have also been taken over by the Houthi. Correspondents of international media and also local journalists working in Yemen in those conditions have been obliged to fly and to flee the territories controlled by a Houthi in Yemen, and they have continued to broadcast outside the state. Saudi Arabia gave a lot of facilities, especially to private channels and media. I would like now to talk about some violations that were committed against journalists, killing, kidnapping, and others. First, I will talk about the killing. Since 2014, more than 45 journalists have been killed since the Houthi coup. They have been killed by direct killing, by bombing, by sniping, assassination with bobby trap devices, assassination by poison, death under torture, while the number of journalists wounded during those years of war exceeded 100 injured. Kidnapping. More than 500 journalists were kidnapped and detained. 4 kidnapped journalists are still in Houthi prisons. 3 are still in the hands of the legitimate government, and 1 journalist is still enforced disappeared by Al-Qaeda. Death sentences. This is one of the means that has been used by the Houthi militias in order to punish journalists. The Houthi militias sentenced journalist 𝗃𝗱𝗶𝗴𝗁 first to death. They have released him later in September 2017, and then they have issued death sentences against 4 journalists. They have been exchanged in an exchange deal with other prisoners, an exchange deal sponsored by the United Nations. Also, the Houthi militias have issued sentences against 7 journalists, including Ahmed al-Musaybi, 𝗃𝗶𝗴𝗵𝗁 al-Rahbi, Nadia al-Saddaq, 𝗂𝗶𝗏 𝗔𝗰𝗰 Hassan Baslim, and Mohammad Kaizan. They have been considered now as fugitives from justice. Some journalists are in Arab capital and others have fled to other governors. As for enforced disappearance, dozens of journalists have been subjected to enforced disappearance by the Houthi militias. We still have a journalist, 𝗂𝗶𝗴𝗁 الصوفي, and the Houthi militias did not disclose anything related to their status since 2015. This is also the case of Muhammad 𝗂𝗚 al-Makri, who has been forcibly disappeared by Al-Qaeda in Hadramaut since 2015. Torture. The majority of journalists who were kidnapped by the Houthi militias and taken to prisons have been subjected to forms of brutal torture. Most notably journalist Anwar al-Rukn, who died a day after his release from Houthi prisons. We have also other journalists such as 𝗃𝗶𝗴𝗁 الْمَنْصُوري, Ahmad Qabil, 𝗵𝗂𝗫𝗀 al-Murtada, and others. They have been found killed after being tortured. In Taiz, a number of journalists have been killed by snipers. We also have, for instance, the case of cameraman of the Yemeni satellite channel, Ahmed al-Shaybani, and photographer Muhammad al-Yemeni. They have been killed by bullets from snipers belonging to the Houthi militias in clashes. Muhammad al-Absi also died in Sana'a, but he was killed by being poisoned. He was preparing and looking into an investigation into the involvement of the Houthi militia leaders in tampering with the oil and black market trade, and he was killed by poison. Human shields. The journalists are also used as human shields, so we would like to ask the international community to make pressure on the Houthi militias and the government so that this tragedy of journalists ends, and thank you.
One more point. If I may add one more point, there's a couple more points why supporting the work of civil society in places like Iraq and Yemen is all the more important and all the more difficult. One is the fact that when these states implement investigative mechanisms in their own country, it's often the case that the systems and processes are run by people linked to, if not implicated in, the violations they're meant to be investigating. So they're often not independent. So a strong civil society movement is critical for ensuring that those anomalies are not allowed to stand as the only record, the historic record of justice for those violations. And the second one is specifically in terms of Iraq. It's also important because there's an attempt to wind down the work of UNITAD, the only UN-mandated investigative mechanism in Iraq covering ISIS. The last resolution only extended it for 1 year, and there is a work to try and end that working and remove any UN investigators from the country. So there will be a need for that to be replaced and to be extended, and for international mechanisms to fill the gap. Thank you.
Thank you.
A technical question. If the militias are not official elements of a state, then can we ask for the implementation of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy if it passed a limit of crimes? Thank you very much.
You can answer.
Yeah, there's of course a couple of discussions taking place within the UN, either on counterterrorism or to regulate the use of mercenaries. All that soft law is very useful and helpful, but it's going to take the states to agree to make some sort of binding obligation, or for courts and tribunals to interpret the existing international obligations as extending to the new definitions or the evolving way in which mercenaries and militias are engaging in terrorism themselves. That's possible, but there's obviously political questions about that as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. You have a comment, if you have any comment.
No, I don't have any specific comments following the questions that were raised, just to highlight the importance that all the mechanisms, the human rights mechanisms, are looking for ways to interpret the available treaties to protect as much as possible the rights of victims without forgetting the basic, namely that human rights violations are a state issue, is a state responsibility. So what is the level, what is the degree, what is the nature of the responsibility depending on the perpetrators. But we have really to distinguish and to clarify the notions, for example, of territory control, of power, of who is actually leading in the country. And all this is creating a confusing framework which has to be faced right now and which is at the core of many of the discussions and reflections of treaty bodies and other human rights mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you. في دقيقة أخيرة للسيدة.
Last word, Mr. Al-Jubairi. I have mentioned a few minutes before we entered the room, we have talked about journalist 𝗂𝗏 who has been beaten. It's the recent case of journalists being repressed in Yemen. And today, this morning, he said that he has been threatened again by the Houthi militias who told him not to write on public affairs and issues. This is another evidence that the repression and the violations against journalists are still going on. Thank you. Thank you very much. So this side event now comes to a close. I would like to thank you for your attention and your presence. Thank you, and see you soon. Thank you very much.